The fluorescent lights buzz overhead like angry insects. 2 in the morning at Oak Creek Memorial in Houston. Laura Bennett pushes through the trauma bay doors with a trauma cart, her movements economical, precise. No wasted motion. Never wasted motion. The ER is controlled chaos, monitors beeping their rhythmic warnings, a respiratory therapist bagging a patient with practiced efficiency, nurses calling out vitals in the terse language of crisis. Nobody looks up when Laura arrives. That's exactly how she prefers it. A code is running in Trauma Bay 3. 63-year-old male, cardiac arrest from acute MI. The attending physician, Dr. Chen, is calling compressions. Laura moves to the medication cart without being asked, hands already reaching for the epinephrine before Chen even voices the order. Her fingers know the locations of every drug, every dose, every syringe. Muscle memory. The kind that comes from muscle that remembers things the mind is trying to forget. 1 milligram epi, for push, Chen calls out. Laura's already drawing it up. The needle slides into the foreport with the kind of certainty that comes from having done this 347 times. Possibly 348. She stopped counting after Ramadi. The heart monitor shows flat line. Still flat line. The chest compressions continue, a nurse counting cadence, hands pushing rhythmically against the patient's sternum. 1, 2, 3, 4. The sound is like someone driving a pile driver into the floor. Each compression cracks ribs with a sound like splitting wood. That's what they don't tell you about CPR. That every successful resuscitation starts with breaking the person who might live. Charge to 360, Chen says. Laura positions the defibrillator pads. Hand steady as a surgical laser. The monitor charges with a high-pitched whine. Everyone steps back. The electricity arcs through the patient's chest, lifting him slightly off the stretcher like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. His body goes rigid. When the current stops, he goes slack again. Resume compressions, Chen says. Back to the percussion of broken ribs. Back to the mathematics of survival. Laura checks the monitor. Still nothing. She moves to stand against the wall, not in the way, but present. Available. Her left leg aches where shrapnel lives under the skin. Old shrapnel. From a collapsing building. From another lifetime. The code runs for 43 minutes. The patient never comes back. At 2:41 a.m., Chen calls it. Time of death, 2:36. The team steps back. The ritual ends. The body is no longer a patient, it's a logistics problem. Someone needs to call the family. Someone needs to clean the room. Someone needs to chart the outcome with meticulous precision. That someone is always Laura. She moves through the paperwork like she's moving through water. Every medication noted. Every procedure documented. Every attending physician who was present. Every timeline exact. The charting is a map of what happened, a record so detailed it's almost a legal document. It occurs to her, not for the first time, that this precision might be a problem. Across the nursing station, Dr. Marcus Sterling watches her. He's standing with his arms crossed, his silver Rolex catching the fluorescent light like a reflection off expensive water. 48 years old. Divorced twice. A medical degree from Johns Hopkins and a side business that Laura's meticulous documentation is slowly and carefully exposing. She doesn't know Sterling is watching her. But Sterling knows about Laura's charts. He knows that every procedure she documents is a piece of a puzzle. A puzzle that, if someone were to study it long enough, would reveal that Sterling has been billing for consultations he never provided, supervisory procedures he never supervised, clinical decisions he never made. The money is significant. The fraud is systematic. And Laura's paperwork is the audit trail that could destroy him. Sterling's jaw tightens as he watches her. His fingers drum against his thigh, a gesture of irritation trying to hide itself as casualness. He looks away. But he's already making calculations. He's already thinking about moves on a board where Laura doesn't even know she's playing. Room 347 is 3 doors down the trauma bay corridor. That's where Jake Villanueva lies. 24 years old. Corporal, United States Marine Corps. 3 days ago, he arrived at Oak Creek Memorial with a traumatic brain injury, the kind that steals your past and hands you back a stranger. He doesn't remember the IED. He doesn't remember the evac. He doesn't remember the woman who pulled him 3 blocks through sniper fire to the extraction point, her hands pressed against the wound in his shoulder, her voice in his ear saying, "Stay with me. Stay. With me." He does remember the tattoo on his forearm. Block letters. Bennett. Dark blue ink, the kind that means something, that was meant to mean something. Every morning, a nurse asks him who Bennett is. Every morning, he looks at the name and feels nothing. A gap where a memory should be. A hole where gratitude should live. Laura passes room 347 without stopping. She can see him through the window, Jake, with his eyes closed, his left arm resting on top of the blanket. His forearm is visible. The tattoo is visible. She's seen the tattoo before. She looks away and keeps walking. Pain is information. That's what they taught her in field medicine training. Pain is data. The ache in her leg, the weight in her chest, the way her jaw clenches when she sees his name in block letters, all of it is information. All of it is data that she's learned to file away in the same folder as nightmares and the smell of dust and the sound of IED concussions rolling across the city of Ramadi like thunder. She moves through her shift like a ghost. That's her specialty. Invisibility. The ability to be present and absent at the same time. For 3 years, that's how she survived at Oak Creek Memorial, by being so thoroughly unremarkable that nobody asks questions. Nobody wonders why a night shift trauma nurse has scars on her hands that look like they come from something other than needle sticks. Nobody notices the way she positions herself with her back to walls. Nobody sees the way her eyes map every exit before she enters a room. The shift continues. A collapsed lung. A femoral artery laceration. A 7-year-old with a head injury that will probably change the course of her entire life. Laura moves through these cases the way water moves through a filter, quietly, thoroughly, completely. Her hands do the work while her mind is somewhere else. Somewhere with dust and concrete and the weight of a man's body against her shoulders as she's dragging him towards safety. At 4:15 a.m., Sterling appears at the medication room door. Laura is counting controlled substances, verifying the inventory against the electronic record. Her handwriting is so precise it could have been printed. "Laura," Sterling says. His voice is honey with glass inside it. "Can we talk?" She doesn't turn around. She marks down a number on the inventory sheet. Exact. Precise. Correct. Of course, Dr. Sterling. She turns to face him. Her posture is correct. Respectful. Her eyes don't make full contact with his, just slightly to the side, the posture of someone who has learned that direct eye contact can be read as aggression. Her hands are folded in front of her. Everything about her says, I am not a threat. I am quiet. I am manageable. Sterling smiles. It's the smile of someone who has already won an argument he hasn't yet started. Your documentation, he says, is incredibly thorough. Thank you, Doctor. Almost too thorough. He steps into the medication room. The door closes behind him. I've noticed you're documenting things that, well, aren't really necessary. Times. Specific attending physicians. Every medication, down to the exact timestamp. Laura's jaw clenches. Just a millimeter of movement. She unclenches it immediately. Hospital policy requires accurate documentation. Of course it does. Sterling nods slowly. But there's documentation, and then there's documentation, if you understand me. Some things are better left a little less specific. A little more flexible. The room goes so quiet you could hear the refrigerator humming behind them. Laura doesn't respond. Sterling waits, expecting either agreement or argument. What he gets instead is silence. The kind of silence that's heavier than words. I'm just saying, he continues, that sometimes less detail creates fewer problems. For everyone. You understand? Laura looks at him. Really looks at him. Her eyes shift to his eyes, and for just a moment, he sees something behind them. Something that's not a night shift trauma nurse. Something that knows how to handle pressure. Something that's seen worse than him. I understand, doctor, she says quietly. He smiles again. He shouldn't have smiled. But he doesn't know that yet. Good, he says. Because I'd hate to see a good nurse like you develop a reputation for, let's call it excessive attention to detail. It could make people uncomfortable. Create unnecessary friction. I'll keep that in mind. He leaves the medication room. As soon as the door closes behind him, Laura's hands begin to shake. Not from fear. From something much more dangerous. From the muscle memory of recognition. From the part of her that spent 12 years learning to identify threats and neutralize them. From the part that knows, with absolute certainty, that Dr. Marcus Sterling has just declared war on someone he thinks is powerless. She's been powerless before. She's done good work in that condition. But that version of her is supposed to be buried. That version is supposed to stay in Ramadi, in the dust, in the rubble of a collapsing building. The shift continues. By the time Laura changes out of her scrubs at 6:13 a.m., the morning light is breaking through the parking lot windows like something that's been waiting all night to get in. She walks to her car. She doesn't look at room 347. She doesn't think about Jake Villanueva's tattoo. She doesn't think about Sterling's smile or the way he'd said the word flexible. She thinks about nothing at all. Or tries to. But her hands are still shaking when she grips the steering wheel, and that's information too. That's data. That's the beginning of something that she can't yet see but that she can absolutely feel coming. The medication errors started appearing 3 days later on the public disciplinary board outside the nurse's station, printed notices in Sterling's careful handwriting. RNL Bennett, medication timing discrepancy under review. Remedial protocols required. A discrepancy she didn't commit. A medication she documented to the minute, administered exactly as Sterling himself had ordered, signed in her neat block letters with timestamp and witness initials. But her name was on the board now. That mattered more than facts ever could. She stood in front of the notice for 30 seconds during shift change, when 14 staff members were transitioning between day and night rotation. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant drone overhead. Conversations died. Phones stopped buzzing. Everyone watched her read her own public humiliation. Sterling emerged from the medication room with a chart in his hands and positioned himself at the center of the nurse's station like an actor taking stage. He was already talking before Laura turned around. Can someone explain to me why Nurse Bennett felt qualified to make autonomous decisions about suturing technique on the Morrison case? His voice dripped with theatrical concern, the voice he used when billing committees needed to hear concern. Laura, do you have special training the rest of us aren't aware of? Laura had learned that silence was sometimes the sharpest weapon available, but Sterling wasn't interested in silence. He was interested in the word no. He was interested in watching her say it while 14 people listened. I documented your orders exactly as you gave them, Dr. Sterling. Her voice came out level. No apologetic inflection. No downward glance. She'd learned that too, looking down was surrender. Sterling laughed. The sound echoed off the tile like a stone skipping across water. My orders? I wasn't even in the building that evening. You see, this is the problem with night shift, nobody's actually supervising. Nurse Bennett here sometimes forgets that assessment and treatment planning require actual medical degrees. I'm not going to have a patient's family questioning my judgment because a nurse got creative with protocol. He turned to face the room, not her. That was worse. That was deliberate. Clipboard. That's what we're calling you now. Because you think charting can substitute for competence. The name spread through Oak Creek Memorial like hospital-grade antiseptic through a wound. Clipboard. By the next evening, she heard it whispered in the medication room. Clipboard's up for her shift. Did Clipboard document that? By the end of the week, some staff members used it to her face, voices carefully neutral, as if they were simply using an accurate descriptor. 3 days later, Sterling came into the Morrison girls' room while Laura was changing the healing facial lacerations, removing old dressing and applying fresh topical antibiotics with the kind of precision that took 3 years of night shift trauma experience to develop smoothly. Sarah Morrison lay still under the bright exam light, 7 years old and trusting, her mother and father watching from the corner chairs. Sterling positioned himself between Laura and the family like he was blocking her from view. Which he was. Which was the point? I apologize for the confusion, he said, his voice dropping into that concerned register again. Nurse Bennett sometimes forgets that assessment and treatment planning require actual medical degrees. Sarah's healing beautifully despite some rather irregular early interventions. We're fortunate there were no complications. Mrs. Morrison's face changed. Laura watched it happen, the doubt settling in like a cloud shadow crossing a field. Is that true? The mother asked, her voice smaller than it had been. Laura didn't stop working. Her hands moved with the kind of steadiness that comes from having once held a femoral artery closed while rounds of 7.62mm ammunition punched through concrete 6 inches to her left. She take the fresh dressing without trembling. Without hesitation. Without responding. Sometimes not defending yourself was the only defense available. Sometimes it was also the cruelest kind of silence, because silence let the doubt do all the work. But that wasn't the worst part. The break room became a place she stopped going. For 6 consecutive shifts, the same pattern repeated itself with machine precision. She would sit down at the vinyl table with her lunch, sandwich, apple, black coffee that had gone cold somewhere between the parking garage and shift change. Within 90 seconds, conversations would stop mid-sentence. Chairs would scrape backward. Locker doors would open with sudden urgent purpose. By 2 minutes, the room would be empty except for the fluorescent hum and the smell of stale coffee and antiseptic, that particular hospital stench that never quite left your scrubs no matter how many times you washed them. She ate alone for 6 straight shifts. 8 hours of night rotation, and the only person who would sit near her was the automatic refrigerator restocking itself and the coffee maker dripping its slow mechanical rhythm. Sterling orchestrated it all with perfect clinical precision. On the afternoon of her 7th shift, he called her to the nurse's station with the entire day's shift present, their ears ready and open like radar dishes. He held a trauma log with a page missing, a page he'd removed himself that morning, pocketing it while the chart was unattended. Laura, where exactly is your signature on this critical medication administration? This is beyond careless. This is dangerous. This is the kind of thing that ends careers. His voice had shifted again, colder now, the performance over. This was the real thing. This was a man who'd decided she was a problem that needed eliminating before she could become an actual threat. Laura took one measured breath. In through her nose. Out through her mouth. The breathing pattern she'd learned in a concrete bunker outside Ramadi while mortar fire walked across the roof in mechanical rhythm. The breathing pattern that kept you alive when everything else was falling apart. A single tear traced down her cheek. Not from fear. Not from shame. From the sheer accumulated weight of weeks of this, the slow suffocation of a reputation being dismantled piece by piece in front of people she worked beside. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact. Her hand was steady. Her voice, when she spoke, came out like still water. I've survived worse than you, Dr. Sterling. Much worse. The room went dead silent. Even the heart monitor on the nearest patient seemed to pause between beats. Sterling's jaw tightened. His face flushed a color that suggested high blood pressure and the beginning of something darker, the recognition that he'd just encountered something he couldn't shame, couldn't diminish, couldn't break with words. She turned and walked back to the trauma bays. Her boots made no sound on the tile floor. Behind her, she heard Sterling finally speak, his voice sharp and strained, "Get her out of this unit. I don't care what protocol requires. I want her gone by end of shift tomorrow." That was when everything changed. That was when the decision got made, not by her, but for her. That was when the institutional machinery, once set in motion by a man with a phone and friends in administration, became unstoppable as a tidal wave. But neither of them knew yet what was coming through those automatic doors. Neither of them knew that Laura's 17-year-old son was sitting in the parking lot right now, holding a shadow box filled with medals he'd found hidden in a storage unit. Neither of them knew that everything Sterling had built was about to collapse in a single afternoon, that the quiet nurse he'd spent weeks trying to destroy carried credentials he couldn't even imagine, that the paper trail of her meticulous charting, the very thing he'd tried to weaponize against her, was about to become the evidence that ended his entire career. The automatic doors of Oak Creek Memorial would open in 72 hours. And everything would change. The phone on Dr. Sterling's mahogany desk rang at 5:27 a.m., before the sun cleared the Houston humidity, before the day shift arrived, before anyone could see what he was about to do. He held the receiver with the confidence of a man who had already calculated every variable. Gerald Voss answered on the second ring, a man who never slept past 5, who checked his phone like a pilot checking instruments. "Gerald. Marcus Sterling. I need a favor, and I need it handled quietly." Sterling's voice carried the weight of leverage. The malpractice case from 2019. The young resident who'd perforated a patient's colon during a routine procedure. Sterling had buried the incident reports, signed off on the incident, made sure Voss's name never appeared in the official documentation. Voss had sent a thank you gift, a Morn blank pen engraved with his initials. Now that pen was about to cost him. What kind of favor? Voss's tone shifted. He understood the transaction. "I need you to flag a credentialing file for the committee. RN named Laura Bennett, night shift, trauma unit. I'm documenting medication errors, documentation irregularities, pattern of patient complaints. Nothing actionable yet, but I want her file flagged for review. Quietly. Before she has a chance to respond." Sterling paused, letting the silence work. "The 2019 case was handled correctly because I made sure it was. I'd hate for that record to surface during a credentialing audit." The line held steady. Voss was calculating. Voss was afraid. Voss was already making notes. "Consider it done, Marcus. By end of business today, her file gets flagged for medical review. Security notation about patient safety concerns. It'll slow any advancement requests, create documentation for future disciplinary action." Voss hung up without goodbye. That was how leverage worked. No pleasantries. No signatures. Just understanding. Sterling set the phone down and immediately dialed the next number. Sharon Hendricks answered on the fourth ring, her voice rough from coffee and early morning. She was a nurse, technically, 23 years retired from bedside care, now an investigator for the Texas Board of Nursing, the kind of person who had learned that cooperation with hospital administrators was far more profitable than adherence to actual oversight protocols. Sterling had cultivated her over 18 months of monthly golf games at River Oaks Country Club. $400 rounds. Drinks after. Conversations about difficult nurses and documentation problems. "Sharon, it's Marcus Sterling at Oak Creek Memorial." He didn't need to establish more than a name. They had a relationship. "I need to file a formal competency concern about an RN on my service. I'll have documentation ready by end of the week, medication administration errors, charting inconsistencies, pattern of concerning incidents. I'll need you to open a preliminary investigation immediately. No publicity. Just a notation in her record that prevents any license advancement or transfer." Sharon was already typing. He could hear the keyboard. "What's the nurse's name?" "Laura Bennett. Night shift, trauma services. She's been creating liability exposure for months, but we've been documenting quietly. I wanted to give the institution a chance to handle it internally, but the incidents are escalating. I think you need to be aware before something serious happens." The word serious did its work. Sharon understood he meant a patient death. She understood the implications of the Board of Nursing being accused of not investigating warning signs. "I'll open the file today, Marcus. Don't worry. Once it's flagged at the state level, her options become very limited. Even if she transfers, the notation follows her. Where will she go if the board's already watching?" Sharon's voice carried the flat certainty of someone who had destroyed careers before. "I'll call you after I file the initial report." Sterling thanked her and hung up. 2 allies. 2 pieces of institutional weight. 1 more phone call to complete the architecture. Patricia Chen, the HR director, took longer to answer. When she did, Sterling could hear the background sounds of her home office, coffee brewing, papers shuffling, the tick of a grandfather clock somewhere in the background. She was already at her desk at 6:04 a.m. Sterling liked that about her. Ambitious. Careful. Eager to document everything because documentation was armor. "Patricia, I'm calling because we have a liability situation on my service that needs immediate documentation and protocol preparation." Sterling chose his words like a surgeon placing sutures. Formal. Careful. Creating a paper trail that looked like responsible management. "I have concerns about an RN's judgment and documentation accuracy. I've been documenting incidents over several weeks, and I need to establish a progressive discipline timeline in case we need to move toward termination." Patricia was already pulling up her system. He could hear her fingers on the keyboard. "Which nurse, Dr. Sterling?" "Laura Bennett, night shift, trauma unit. I have 3 separate incidents documented: medication administration errors, charting inaccuracies, and a near-miss safety event. Nothing catastrophic yet, but a pattern is forming. I'm going to schedule a formal disciplinary meeting with her for next Monday. I'll present the documentation, advise her of her options for remediation, and if she doesn't accept full accountability, we'll proceed with immediate termination. I need you prepared to execute a final paycheck and exit interview by end of that day." Patricia's voice had taken on the careful tone of someone managing liability. "Do we need security notified? Should she be escorted from the building?" "Yes. Once she's been terminated, I want her badge deactivated immediately and security walking her to her car. We can't take chances with someone who might retaliate. I'll brief security myself on Monday morning before the meeting." Sterling paused, letting her understand the gravity. She's been a model employee on the surface, so this might upset her. I want to be prepared for any kind of reaction. Patricia made a note, potential for emotional escalation noted. Security briefing mandatory. I'll have everything prepared, Dr. Sterling. Does she know any of this is coming? No. She has no idea. I want to keep it that way until the formal meeting. No heads up, no chance for her to prepare a defense or contact anyone. The meeting is the first she hears of it. After Patricia hung up, Sterling sat in his office with the sunrise bleeding through the windows, catching the edges of his diplomas, his framed photographs with hospital donors, his shelf of books about medical leadership that he had never actually read. 3 calls. 3 allies. 1 nurse about to have every door closed simultaneously. Laura had no idea what was being constructed around her. No idea that her credentialing file was being flagged in 12 different hospital systems, that the State Nursing Board was opening a preliminary investigation based on fabricated documentation, that HR was preparing her termination packet. She came to work on Thursday night at 11 p.m., expecting the familiar routine, checking the assignment board, reviewing census, beginning her 12-hour shift on a unit that had become hostile territory. But subtle things had changed. Her code team assignments had disappeared. The trauma certification she'd been promised for her resume was suddenly under review. When she requested a meeting with Sterling to discuss her upcoming performance evaluation, his administrative assistant delivered the message with barely concealed sympathy: "Dr. Sterling has a fully booked schedule for the next 2 weeks. I don't have an opening until late April. It was early April. The other nurses moved around her with the careful distance of people who'd been warned. Not hostile. Not quite kind. Just careful. Their conversation stopped when she entered the break room. They found reasons to leave when she sat down. The senior nurses, the ones who'd been working nights for years, simply avoided her entirely. By Friday morning, Laura understood the architecture even if she couldn't see its blueprint. The walls were closing. The pathway was narrowing. Something was happening in the administrative infrastructure, something that moved quietly through phone calls and emails, something that had nothing to do with her clinical competence and everything to do with something she'd done that threatened someone more powerful. She was hanging her scrubs in her locker, scrubs still bearing faint rust-colored stains from the construction worker's blood, from the needle decompression she'd performed while every doctor in the trauma bay had frozen, when she noticed her work schedule had been reprinted and taped to her locker door. Her shifts had been changed. All of them. She'd been moved to the least desirable rotation, 11 p.m. to 11 a.m. on weekends, paired with the most junior nurses on staff, rotated off the trauma team entirely. The paper felt thin between her fingers. 1 page. Her entire world remade in administrative text. What she didn't know, what no one at Oak Creek Memorial had told her, was that Sterling had already placed 3 fabricated incident reports in her personnel file. The first documented a medication error involving a dose of morphine she had never administered to a patient she'd never cared for. The second was a formal patient complaint from a family who had never been interviewed, typed on official letterhead with Sterling's signature below it. The third was a near-miss safety report from a nurse who'd been off duty the day of the incident, witnessed by no one, documented by Sterling using the hospital's electronic system and falsified timestamp. The termination meeting was scheduled for Monday at 8 a.m. Sterling had already prepared the words he would use. He had already decided which administrator would be present. He had already called security to brief them on its potential for emotional escalation and requested that they be standing by to escort her to her vehicle once the termination was complete. Laura walked past room 347 on her way out of the hospital at 7 a.m. Jake Villanueva was sitting up in bed, his eyes scanning the hallway with the intensity of someone searching for something precious. The traumatic brain injury had stolen his memories of her face, of the 3 blocks she'd carried him through sniper fire, of the moment she'd shielded his body with her own while calling for evacuation. But his forearm still bore the tattoo. Still carried her name in block letters across his skin. He saw her walking past and his eyes lit up with the hope of someone close to recognition but just missing it. Laura kept walking. She didn't stop. She didn't acknowledge him. The guilt felt like shrapnel embedded in her chest, sharp and impossible to remove. She had survived Ramadi. She had pulled 17 wounded operators from a collapsing building under fire. She had held a femoral artery closed with her bare hand for 40 minutes while extracting a teammate through a kill zone. She had done things in the darkness that civilian minds weren't built to comprehend. But as she walked to her car at 7:15 a.m. on a Friday morning in Houston, with her employment architecture collapsing around her like a building under bombardment and no idea that 3 institutional allies had just activated the machinery of her destruction, Laura Bennett understood something with absolute clarity: sometimes the enemy doesn't come with a gun. Sometimes the enemy comes with a phone call. At 2:17 a.m. on a Friday, the automatic doors exploded open like someone had detonated the hinges from inside. Derek Ham came through them the way a freight train comes through a station, all momentum and noise and the absolute certainty of collision. 250 pounds of construction worker and PCP and terror, a rebar puncture wound in his left flank leaking blood down his work pants, and in his right hand, a metal fur stand he'd ripped from the wall of the waiting room. He was screaming about bugs. Bugs under his skin, bugs in his lungs, bugs that needed to come out. The metal stand whistled through the air like a medieval weapon. A resident named Chen dove behind the medication cart. Another resident, younger, maybe 26, sprinted toward the supply room. 3 nurses scattered like startled birds, their footsteps echoing down the corridor toward the exit. Dr. Sterling locked himself inside the medication room and didn't emerge. Laura Bennett was standing 20 feet away when Derek charged the trauma bay. She didn't run. Didn't hesitate. Didn't call for security or backup or anyone else. She simply stood and watched him for 1/2 second, reading him the way she'd once read suspects approaching a checkpoint in Ramadi, the way she'd learned to read men whose fear made them dangerous. Then she walked toward him. Not fast. Not slow. The same steady gait she'd used approaching IED suspects when everyone else took cover, when the building around you might collapse and the only thing between your team and that collapse was the person willing to walk straight into the pressure. Her voice came low and calm, the kind of steady that doesn't ask permission. Derek. Derek, look at me. You can't breathe right, can you? He swung. The force-stand cut through the air where her head had been a 1/2 second before. She'd already sidestepped, already closed the distance, her hands loose and ready like a boxer who'd done this 1,000 times before. That's why you're scared. That bug feeling, that's not bugs. That's your lung. Your left lung collapsed. That's the pressure. I can fix it, but I need you on the ground first. His eyes were wide, pupils blown dark as wells. The PCP had him vibrating at a frequency just below violence. He swung again. She moved into the angle instead of away from it, used his momentum against the stopping point of his own shoulder joint. One smooth motion, the kind of motion that comes from training so deep it lives in muscle memory, in the places where consciousness doesn't need to go. Elbow locked. Rotation controlled. Descent managed. He hit the floor without injury. She was already moving. Already reading him. The hyperresonance on his left chest wall, the trachea pushed to the right, the distended neck veins like cables under his skin. Tension pneumothorax. The collapsed lung was compressing his heart, cutting off his oxygen, flooding his brain with the panic of drowning while surrounded by air. The bug feeling. The wrongness that made a man swing metal at nothing. 14-gauge catheter. Now. She didn't wait for response. Grabbed it herself from the trauma cart, hand steady as surgical steel. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The landmark that separated living from not living by maybe 2 centimeters. She felt for it, muscle memory and anatomy and the kind of certainty that comes from having done this when buildings were falling around her, when the patient was screaming, when the pressure was absolute. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping was the most beautiful sound in the trauma bay. Pressure releasing. The pneumothorax decompressing. Derek's breathing eased. His eyes focused. The color returned to his face like someone turning up a dimmer switch. 3 security guards arrived 90 seconds too late, their radios crackling with codes that no longer applied. Derek Ham started crying. Thanked her. Thanked her like she'd given him back his life instead of just making it possible to breathe again. Dr. Sterling emerged from the medication room and watched the last 30 seconds of the intervention play out before him. He saw her standing there, blood on her scrubs, her hand still holding the catheter steady, her voice still calm as she directed the nurses on oxygen flow and for access. He saw the way the residents looked at her. The way that moment, that impossible moment when everyone else scattered and one person walked forward, had rewritten something in the room's architecture. His face went white. By 3 a.m., Sterling had reviewed the security footage for times. The angle was perfect. Every frame captured. Derek's assault from every direction. Laura's approach. The assessment that took 3 seconds. The execution that took 5. The save that took maybe 90 seconds total. Irrefutable. Crystal clear. The kind of footage that made fabricated incident reports look exactly like what they were, desperate lies meant to destroy someone because you were afraid of her. By 5 a.m., he'd made the calls. All 3. Gerald Voss first, the board chairman who still owed him for burying that malpractice case 5 years ago. Then investigator Hendricks at the Texas Board of Nursing, the man he'd cultivated on golf courses and over drinks, the man who had made 3 previous complaints against other nurses simply because Sterling had suggested it. Finally, Patricia Chen in HR. She was new enough that she didn't yet understand how the hospital really worked. Young enough to be impressed by authority. Malleable enough to accept that the best nurse on staff, the one who'd caught 3 medication errors that other people missed, the one who'd trained half the junior nurses, the one who'd worked 14 years at the hospital without a single genuine complaint, had suddenly become a liability. By 6:15 a.m., the fabricated incident report had been filed. Use of excessive force against a patient. Unprovoked violence. Assault. The language was careful. The implication was total. By 7 a.m., Laura was in HR still wearing her blood-stained scrubs, and Patricia Chen was reading from a prepared statement like someone reading a death sentence they didn't write and didn't understand. Laura Bennett, you are hereby suspended pending investigation into use of excessive and unprovoked violence against a patient. You are to surrender your badge and ID immediately and exit the premises. The Houston Police Department will conduct a separate investigation into potential criminal assault charges. Sterling stood in the back of the room, arms crossed. His face had regained its color. The tactic was elegant in its simplicity: redefine an act of heroism as an act of violence. Make the save look like an assault. Use her own competence against her. The footage that was meant to exonerate her would be reframed as evidence of excessive force, of a nurse who'd gone beyond protocol, who'd used techniques that weren't approved by administration. The fact that those techniques had saved Derek Ham's life meant nothing. The narrative was everything. Laura said nothing. Took one measured breath, the kind of breath a person takes when they've already survived worse and know how to survive this too. She removed her badge from her pocket and set it on the desk. Her fingers didn't shake. Her voice didn't crack. She simply stood, turned, and walked out in her blood-stained scrubs, past Sterling, past Chen, past the entire architecture of institutional power that had been arranged to crush her. The parking lot was empty at 7:15 a.m. Houston heat already starting, humidity like a weight. Her shift had been 12 hours. The next 12 were already scheduled. She'd never make it. 2 weeks later, the termination notice arrived by certified mail. Willful misconduct. Violation of patient safety protocols. Ineligible for rehire. All the language Sterling had carefully coached Chen to use. The notice included a statement: due to her suspension and pending criminal charges, her employment was being terminated effective immediately. She would be contacted by legal regarding her severance package, which was being withheld pending the outcome of the police investigation. Marcus read it before his mother got home. Her 17-year-old son sat on the kitchen counter with the certified mail in his hands and understood something he'd been trying to understand for 2 years: his mother wasn't just struggling. His mother was being destroyed. He didn't ask permission. He didn't tell her what he was planning. At 10 a.m. the following Wednesday, he walked into Oak Creek Memorial's main lobby holding a shadow box that contained everything his mother had hidden from him, everything she'd buried so deep he'd had to dig through the back of a storage unit to find it. Bronze stars. Purple hearts. A Navy cross, faded and real and impossible. She was a senior chief petty officer. She'd carried men out of burning buildings while people were shooting at her. She'd held someone's blood vessel closed with her bare hand for 40 minutes while getting them to safety. And they were destroying her for saving someone's life. Before dawn broke on Wednesday morning, Dr. Marcus Sterling sat in his office with the door locked and 3 phone calls still trembling in his hands. The first went to board chairman Gerald Voss at 5:36 a.m. She used excessive force on a patient. I have security footage. We need to move fast. Credentialing action, immediate suspension, before she files a grievance. Voss, still half asleep, asked one question: can it stick? Sterling said yes. The second call came at 5:58 a.m. to Texas Board of Nursing investigator Sharon Hendricks, a woman Sterling had cultivated over 4 years of golf games and consulting fees disguised as expert testimony. I need an expedited review. 1 case. Allegations of violence against a patient. Can you have preliminary findings by end of business? Hendricks, her voice careful, said she could. The third call went to HR Director Patricia Chen at 6:04 a.m. Terminate her employment before she has a chance to provide her statement. Do it quietly. Do it this morning. Before she can respond to anything. Chen said she'd need documentation. Sterling promised it. What Sterling didn't know was that the FBI had been documenting every single one of his calls for 8 months. Laura walked out of Oak Creek Memorial at 7:33 a.m. that same Wednesday, escorted by 2 hospital security officers, not arrested, but treated exactly like it. Her scrubs were still stained with the construction workers' blood, dark rust-colored patches across her torso and both forearms. She'd asked 3 times if she could change clothes. HR had said no. You need to leave the premises immediately. The words felt like they'd been rehearsed. They probably had. As she was walking toward the parking lot, an Oak Creek Memorial officer handed her a suspension notice printed on official letterhead, pending investigation into allegations of excessive and unprovoked violence against a patient. Police will be in contact regarding potential criminal charges. The paper shook slightly as she read it, but her face remained level. Somewhere in a security office, cameras captured her reading the notice without changing expression. Somewhere in a police precinct across town, Detective Marcus Webb was receiving a complaint form describing a violent assault by a staff member. The construction worker, the PCP-addled man whose life she'd saved, was being discharged home with a prescription for pain management and a story he'd never remember, still alive because of the 14-gauge needle she'd driven through his chest. 2 weeks dissolved into a haze of legal consultations and police interviews and the slow realization that competence meant nothing when someone with institutional power wanted you gone. Laura's attorney, a contract lawyer named David Kessler from a strip mall firm in Bellaria, explained the theory of the case. Dr. Sterling's testimony against the security footage would be his word versus hers, but she had used a restraint technique without verbal warning, and in Texas, that could be framed as assault. We can fight it, Kessler said, but fighting takes money. Fighting takes time. Laura had $30,000 in savings and no income. She thought about going back to the VA. She thought about just stopping. Instead, on a Tuesday afternoon that felt like every other Tuesday afternoon, she walked into the Michael E. Adebaki VA hospital and took a number in the mental health clinic. The waiting area smelled like old coffee and floor wax and the particular exhaustion that comes from surviving things civilians don't understand. Around her sat men and women in various states of fracture, a man with an empty right sleeve, a woman whose hands wouldn't stop trembling, a veteran who kept checking the door like someone might come through it with a weapon. Laura took a seat near the window and stared at nothing, understanding with sudden clarity that she'd become one of them. This wasn't temporary. This was the new topography of her life. Rock bottom wasn't dramatic. It was fluorescent lights and a number on a ticket and the recognition that you'd failed everyone, your son, your therapist, yourself. That was the moment Marcus Bennett, age 17, walked into the main lobby of Oak Creek Memorial carrying a shadow box made from dark walnut and glass. Inside the shadow box, arranged with military precision on a field of midnight blue satin, were 4 medals suspended from ribbons. The first was a bronze star. The second was another bronze star, this one with a small bronze V device affixed to the ribbon, denoting valor. The third was another bronze star with valor. The fourth medal hung slightly lower, isolated on its own mounting, the Navy Cross, the second highest decoration the United States Navy could award. Beneath each medal, small brass plaques were engraved with dates. Beneath the entire arrangement sat a folded document, a service record excerpt showing 17 confirmed combat saves. Marcus had picked up the phone at 2 p.m. that day and called Oak Creek Memorial's main switchboard. I need the hospital administrator. It's important. 3 transfers later he was speaking with Chief of Staff Dr. Richard Whitmore. My mother used to work there. Laura Bennett. She was fired this week for saving someone's life. I have documentation of her actual accomplishments. I'm coming to the lobby. I need everyone who made this decision to see it. Whitmore, confused but sensing something significant, told security to let the kid through. By 3:53 p.m., Laura's suspension notice was 13 days old when Marcus walked through those glass doors carrying proof of who his mother actually was. She'd barely spoken to him in 6 months. They'd exchanged maybe 40 words total. The last real conversation they'd had was when he asked if she was okay and she'd lied and said yes. He'd known she was lying. He'd stopped asking. And now he stood in the center of Oak Creek Memorial's main lobby holding a shadow box that contained every version of his mother she'd tried to bury. Nurses stopped charting. Orderlies paused mid-stride. An administrator appeared. Then another. Word spread like electricity through the building, someone's in the lobby with military medals. By the time Hospital Chief of Staff Dr. Whitmore descended from his 5th-floor office, a small crowd had gathered, staff who'd never known what Laura was, who'd watched her get fired, who suddenly understood they'd been looking at a legend and calling her just a nurse. Master Chief Daniel Cortez arrived at 4:22 p.m., still wearing his dress blues from a recruiting event at Rice University across town. He was a compact man with a beard precisely trimmed to regulation length and eyes that had seen everything worth remembering and plenty worth forgetting. He'd gotten a call from someone at the FBI, an agent named Torres who'd said, "Senior Chief Bennett just got destroyed by a doctor committing fraud. Her kid is about to show her medals at her hospital. You should probably be there." Cortez had left the recruiting event mid-sentence. He stood in that lobby in full uniform and he started talking. "Bronze Star," he said, voice cutting clean through the ambient noise like a knife. "Operation in Ramadi, 2007. Extracted 2 wounded personnel under sustained fire." He paused. People stared. "Bronze Star with Valor," he continued. "Same operation, 2 weeks later. Direct action raid." She was a corpsman then. She stayed behind to treat a casualty while the rest of her unit moved to secondary positions. 50-meter corridor. 3 enemy fighters. She treated and moved the patient anyway. Another pause. The silence had weight now. "Bronze Star with Valor," he said again. 2008, ambush in Anbar province. She held the casualty's femoral artery closed with her bare hand for 40 minutes while we extracted him through a kill zone. 40 minutes. Not 39. 40. He looked directly at Marcus. "Your mother is why I still have a brother." 2 FBI agents in dark suits walked through the lobby doors at 4:51 p.m., and the hospital's administrative mood shifted immediately from confusion to something closer to dread. Agent Torres, a woman with dark hair pulled tight and a voice that didn't ask questions, stated the facts. "Dr. Marcus Sterling has been under federal investigation for 8 months regarding fraudulent billing practices affecting approximately 437 patient cases. His billing records indicated he was supervising procedures where cell phone records place him in restaurants, at home, or playing golf." Laura Bennett's detailed charting documentation provided the evidence pattern we needed to proceed with prosecution. She paused. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. "Additionally, we have probable cause to believe Dr. Sterling filed a false report against Nurse Bennett to intimidate her before she could provide testimony to this agency. The assault allegation is demonstrably false and was filed to prevent her from corroborating our investigation." Hospital Chief of Staff Dr. Richard Whitmore stood very still. Then he made a decision. At 5:13 p.m., Dr. Marcus Sterling's hospital access was terminated. His office was locked. His credentials were pulled. His medical license was referred to the Texas Medical Board with documentation of fraudulent billing spanning nearly a decade. By 5:22 p.m., local news crews, tipped off by the FBI's media liaison, had positioned themselves in the main lobby. They filmed Dr. Whitmore's statement, effective immediately. "Dr. Marcus Sterling is terminated for cause. Investigation has revealed a pattern of fraudulent billing practices and filing of false allegations against nursing staff." They filmed Sterling being escorted out by hospital security at 5:44 p.m., his face the color of old paper, his eyes moving left and right like a cornered animal's. They filmed him being placed in a waiting police car. They filmed everything. By evening, the story had reached local television. By morning, it was regional news. The headline wrote itself, "Decorated Navy Officer Vindicated After Doctor's Fraud Exposed." Laura's name appeared in paragraph 2. Master Chief Cortez gave an interview where he talked about integrity and about what real courage looked like. He talked about his sister and what she meant to him. He called Laura Bennett one of the finest warriors I've ever known. 6 months passed. Laura worked her way through the criminal case against Sterling, testified about his orchestrated suspension, watched him accept a plea deal for fraud that included 14 months in federal prison and permanent medical license revocation. She sat in the VA office of Dr. Patricia Okonkwo and started talking. Really talking. About Ramadi. About the IED suspects. About the janitor and the metal tray and the sidearm she'd almost used. About her son and the gap between them. The nightmares came less frequently. She slept more. Someone walking through Houston Community College's campus one afternoon spotted Dr. Marcus Sterling in a cinderblock room with flickering fluorescent lights, standing before a CPR training class, demonstrating chest compressions on a plastic dummy in exchange for $17 an hour. His shirt had a coffee stain. His eyes didn't make contact with anyone. He demonstrated the technique. He answered questions in a voice that had lost its authority. That was the new shape of his life. 1,340 square feet. One broken career. Minimum wage instruction to students who checked their phones while he talked. Laura Bennett returned to Oak Creek Memorial on a Tuesday morning as the new director of trauma services. The appointment came after a national search that included candidates from Johns Hopkins and Massachusetts General. She'd asked for one thing in negotiation: the creation of a veteran-to-healthcare mentorship program, recruiting former military medical personnel into civilian nursing and clinical roles. They'd agreed immediately. The program launched with 12 participants. Jake Villanueva was number 1. His traumatic brain injury meant his memory of her face would never return, but his body remembered. His forearm still carried her name in block letters. She'd visited him twice during his hospitalization. They talked about discharge planning and pain management and whether he had support at home. On the third visit, she brought something with her, a photograph taken during a field hospital operation in Ramadi, dated 2007. In it, a younger version of herself was kneeling beside a stretcher, hand steady, face focused, wearing the same expression he sometimes saw in his dreams. "That's me," she said simply. "That's what I was doing when I found you." He'd wept. She'd held his hand. On her first morning as director, she opened a modest office with east-facing windows and morning sunlight. On the shelf beside her medical texts and professional certifications sat one personal item, a pair of worn combat boots, laces still stained with Ramadi dust, soles cracked from 3 years of forward operating base patrols. The boots that had carried her through hell and back. The reminder that some battles never really end and some warriors never really stop fighting, even when the uniform changes. If you ever find yourself working in an environment where someone is being systematically destroyed for competence, for integrity, for threatening someone else's corruption, speak up. Document everything. Believe the quiet ones. The nurses keeping detailed records aren't being obsessive. They're doing exactly what warriors do. They're preparing for the moment everything depends on having told the truth. Please subscribe, like, and comment below. Share this with someone who needs to know that sometimes the people who save lives do it without ever wearing a uniform. That's the story of Laura Bennett. Thank you for listening.